You are listening to HOA Neighbor Wars. This is the pettiest parking war ever. I am an HVAC dispatcher in Portland, Oregon, and I record every call and ticket because that is the only way to survive in service work. I moved into the villas at Lakeview HOA Incorporated 6 months ago because the rent was reasonable, and I needed to rebuild my finances after a bad year. The complex looked fine during the tour. Tidy landscaping, fresh paint, normal parking lot. What they did not mention was that the vendor coordinator, Donna Perez, treated tow companies like paid muscle and turned guest parking into a shakedown racket. I backed into my assigned space one Thursday afternoon after a 12-hour shift, and before I could even grab my lunch bag from the passenger seat, Donna was standing at my driver window with a handheld radio in one hand and a smug smile on her face. She tapped the glass with her knuckles. I rolled it down. She said, "You are in violation. Backing in is prohibited. You need to pull forward right now or I am calling the tow truck." I blinked at her. I said, "Backing in is prohibited?" She nodded. I do not care what you think. I care what the rule says. I pulled out my phone and opened the HOA documents I had saved when I signed the lease. I scrolled to the parking section. There was nothing about backing in. I showed her the screen. She did not even look. She said, "Keep arguing. You are making my case for me." Then she lifted the handheld radio to her mouth and called someone. I heard her say, "Unit 214, green sedan, non-compliant parker, send the truck." My heart kicked. I said, "Wait. I am in my assigned space. I have the permit decal on my windshield." She shrugged. Backing in is a safety issue. It is in the updated rules. You should have read the packet we mailed last month. I never got a packet. She smiled wider. That is not my problem. I stepped out of my car. I said, "If it is a rule, show me the rule." She clicked her pen twice. She said, "I do not have to show you anything. I enforce what the board tells me to enforce." I could hear a truck engine in the distance getting louder. I checked my watch. It was 4:30, and the management office closed at 5. I had one shot to deliver a dispute packet in person if I wanted to fight this before they sent it to collections. I said, "I am not moving my car until you show me the rule in writing." She laughed. She said, "Fine, then you can pay the tow fee and the administrative processing fee and the storage fee when you pick it up tomorrow." The tow truck turned into the lot. It was a flatbed with a wheel lift attachment, amber lights already flashing. The driver hopped out, clipboard in hand, and walked straight to Donna. They spoke for a moment. He glanced at my car, then at me. He said, "You want me to hook it?" She said yes. He said, "You got the authorization?" She pulled a paper from her crossbody bag and handed it to him. He glanced at it, shrugged, and walked back to his truck. I said, "This is insane. I am parked in my own space." Donna said, "You are parked illegally in your space. There is a difference." I pulled out my phone again and started recording. She immediately stepped closer and said, "You cannot record me without my consent." I said, "Oregon is a one-party consent state. I can record any conversation I am part of." She turned away and muttered something into her radio. The tow truck driver backed his truck up to my car. The wheel lift started extending. I felt my chest tighten. I was rebuilding my finances after a bad year, and I could not absorb bogus fees. The tow invoice would be $200 minimum, plus whatever administrative nonsense Donna wanted to pile on. I had to stop this now. The driver worked fast. He did not ask me to move, did not check if I had keys, just started securing the lift. I walked up to him and said, "I am the owner. I am right here. This is my assigned space, and she has not shown me any rule that says I cannot back in." He said, I just do what I am told. If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA. I said, I am taking it up with the HOA right now, but she is the one who called you, and she has not provided any documentation. He shrugged. He said, I got the authorization slip. That is all I need. Donna stood 10 feet away with her phone out filming me. She had this smug smile like she was collecting evidence for a highlight reel. I realized she was not just enforcing a rule, she was creating a record to justify the fee and shut down any appeal. I turned my phone toward her and said, for the record, I asked for the rule in writing, and she refused. She said, for the record, you are refusing to comply, and that makes this an escalated safety issue. The wheel lift locked. The driver climbed into his truck and started raising the rear of my car. I felt dizzy. I said, you are really going to tow my car out of my own space because I backed in? Donna said, you had a chance to fix it. You chose to argue instead. She clicked her pen 3 more times. I noticed a woman walking her dog on the sidewalk about 50 yards away, phone out, filming the whole scene from a safe distance. I made a mental note to find her later. I said, I want your name and your supervisor's name. Donna said, my name is Donna Perez. I am the vendor coordinator for the Villas at Lakeview HOA Incorporated, and I do not have a supervisor, I report to the board. I said, then I want the board president's contact information. She said, you can submit a written request to the management office. I checked my watch again. 4:40. I had 20 minutes. I said, where is the management office? She said, off-site, you will have to look it up. I pulled out my phone and searched the HOA website. The address was 15 minutes away. I looked at my car, now fully hooked and ready to roll. I said, if you tow my car, I am filing a dispute and demanding a hearing. Donna said, you can file whatever you want, the fee is still due within 72 hours or it goes to collections. I said, you cannot send a disputed fee to collections, that is illegal. She said, keep arguing, you are making my case for me. The tow truck started rolling forward. I shouted at the driver. I said, stop, I am calling the police. He stopped. Donna said, go ahead, call them. They will tell you this is a civil matter and they cannot do anything. I dialed 911 anyway. The dispatcher answered. I explained the situation. She said, if the property owner or their agent has authorized the tow, we cannot intervene. You will need to pursue it through small claims court or an HOA dispute process. I hung up. Donna was still filming me. She said, did they help? I did not answer. The truck pulled my car out of the space and stopped at the lot exit. The driver hopped out and handed me a bright yellow sticker. He said, this is your tow receipt. Call the yard if you want to pick it up. You will need your license, registration, and $240 cash or card. I took the sticker. It had no readable text, just logos and phone numbers. He drove away. My car disappeared around the corner. I stood in the empty parking space, shaking. Donna walked past me and said, next time, park like everyone else. I sprinted to my apartment, grabbed my laptop and a folder with printed HOA documents and ran to my roommate's car. He was at work, but I had a spare key for emergencies. I drove to the management office and got there at 4:58. The door was still unlocked. A woman at the front desk looked up. I said, I need to file a dispute. My car was just towed out of my assigned space for backing in, and nobody has shown me a rule that prohibits it. She said, do you have the tow receipt? I handed her the yellow sticker. She scanned it, typed something, and said, "The fee is $240, plus a $50 administrative processing fee, due within 72 hours. I said, "I am disputing the fee. I was in my assigned space. I have the permit decal, and the vendor coordinator could not provide any written rule." She said, "I will note the dispute, but the fee is still due." I said, "You cannot charge me for a rule that does not exist." She said, "The board updated the parking rules last month. All residents received a notice." I said, "I did not receive a notice." She shrugged. She said, "If you did not receive it, that is a mailing issue, but the rule is still in effect." I said, "Then show me the rule." She said, "I do not have access to the updated rules here. You will need to request them in writing." I said, "I am requesting them right now." She said, "In writing means a formal written request submitted to the board. We will respond within 30 days. I said, "I need the rules today so I can file a proper dispute." She said, "I cannot give you what I do not have." I said, "Then how do you enforce rules you cannot provide?" She said, "The vendor coordinator has the updated rules. She was trained on them last month." I said, "She refused to show them to me." The woman at the desk clicked her pen twice. She said, "If you want to appeal, you can request a hearing with the board, but you still need to pay the fee first." I said, "That is extortion." She said, "That is policy." The clock on the wall hit 5. She said, "We are closed. You need to leave." I said, "I am not leaving until I get a copy of the rules." She stood up and said, "If you do not leave, I will call the police." I left. I sat in my roommate's car in the parking lot and called my friend Eric, a contractor who had worked in the complex a few months ago. He picked up on the second ring. I explained what happened. He said, "Donna did the same thing to me. She tried to tow my work truck because I did not have a guest pass, even though I was on a job for one of the residents." I said, "Did you fight it?" He said, "No, I just paid the fee and never came back. It was not worth the hassle." I said, "I cannot afford to just pay it. I am already stretched thin." He said, "Do you have any proof she is making this up?" I said, "I have video of her refusing to show me the rule, and I have the original HOA documents that do not mention backing in." He said, "That is good, but you need more. You need to show she is targeting people selectively." I said, "How do I prove that?" He said, "Look at the parking lot. I bet half the cars are backed in and she is not towing them." I thanked him and hung up. I drove back to the complex and walked through the entire parking lot with my phone out. I counted 43 cars backed into spaces. I took photos of each one, making sure the permit decals were visible in the frame, but with no readable text. I checked the timestamps. It was 6:15. If Donna was enforcing a no backing in rule, she was doing it selectively, and that was evidence of targeted harassment. I went back to my apartment and started building a case file. I printed the photos, highlighted the original HOA parking rules that said nothing about backing in, and wrote a timeline of the incident. Then I searched online for HOA dispute processes in Oregon. I found a state statute that said HOAs must provide written notice of rule changes at least 30 days before enforcement, and residents must have an opportunity to comment. If Donna was enforcing a rule that was updated last month, and I never received notice, the enforcement was invalid. I called the tow yard and asked how much it would cost to get my car back. The guy said, $240, plus $20 per day storage starting tomorrow. I said, "I am disputing the tow." He said, "That is between you and whoever called us. We just hold the car until the fee is paid." I hung up. I could not afford to let it sit there and rack up storage fees. I checked my bank account. I had $312. If I paid the tow fee, I would have $72 left, and rent was due in 2 weeks. I felt my chest tighten again. This was exactly the kind of financial trap I was trying to avoid. I decided to pay the fee to get my car back, but I would keep fighting the dispute and demand a refund. I drove to the tow yard the next morning, handed over $240, and got my car. The guy at the counter said, "You got lucky. If you had waited another day, it would have been $260. I said, "This is not luck. This is extortion." He said, "Talk to whoever called the tow." I drove back to the complex and parked in my assigned space, pulling in forward this time. I checked my mailbox. There was a bright yellow envelope with no return address. I opened it. Inside was a letter on Villas at Lakeview HOA letterhead with no readable text, just the logo and a block of printed paragraphs. The letter said I owed an additional $50 administrative processing fee for the parking violation, due within 14 days. If I did not pay, the HOA would pursue collections and place a lien on my account. I felt my blood pressure spike. I called the management office. The same woman answered. I said, "I just got a letter demanding a $50 administrative fee, but I already paid the tow fee, and I am disputing the entire incident." She said, "The tow fee goes to the tow company, the administrative fee goes to the HOA. They are separate charges." I said, "You are charging me for enforcing a rule that does not exist." She said, "The rule exists, you just have not seen it yet." I said, "That is circular logic." She said, "If you want to dispute the fee, request a hearing with the board." I said, "How do I request a hearing?" She said, "Submit a written request. We will schedule it within 60 days. I said, 60 days? She said, "The board meets once a month, and the schedule is full for the next 2 meetings. I said, "So I am supposed to wait 2 months to dispute a fee for a rule nobody can show me?" She said, "That is the process." I hung up. I went to work and spent my lunch break researching Oregon HOA laws. I found a section on records requests. Residents have the right to inspect HOA records, including meeting minutes, financial reports, and enforcement logs, with 5 business days' notice. I drafted a formal records request and emailed it to the management office, copying the board president and Donna Perez. I requested all parking enforcement records for the past 6 months, all updated rule documents, and all meeting minutes where parking rules were discussed. I sent it at 1:30. By 3, I got a reply from the management office. The email said my request was received and would be processed within 10 business days, and there would be a $25 records processing fee. I replied and said the fee was not listed in the bylaws and I was not paying it. No response. That night, I got a knock on my door. I opened it. It was my neighbor from across the hall, an older man named Greg. He said, "Did you get towed yesterday?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Donna is out of control. She has been targeting people all month. I saw her put a boot on someone's car last week because their guest did not have a pass, even though the guest was only there for 20 minutes. I said, "Did the person fight it?" He said, "No. They paid the removal fee and left." He said, "You should talk to the other residents. I think a lot of people are scared of her, but nobody wants to be the first to complain." I said, "I am already filing a dispute." He said, "Good. Let me know if you need a witness. I saw the whole thing from my window yesterday." I thanked him and closed the door. The next day, I printed flyers with my email and taped them to every mailbox in the complex. The flyer said, "If you have been unfairly towed, booted, or fined by the HOA vendor coordinator, contact me. We may be able to file a group complaint. By the end of the week, I had 12 emails. Half of them were guests who got towed for not displaying a pass, even though the residents never received guest passes to give them. 3 were residents who got booted for parking in unmarked guest spots. 2 were people who got fined for parking on the street during street sweeping, even though the HOA has no authority over public streets. I compiled all the stories into a single document and attached the photos I had taken of the backed-in cars. I sent the package to the board president with a subject line that said, "Pattern of selective enforcement and illegal fee collection." 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered. A man said, "This is Kevin. I am the board president for Villas at Lakeview. I got your email." I said, "Good. Are you going to address the problem?" He said, "I am looking into it, but I need to be clear. Donna is an independent contractor. She does not work for the board. She works for the management company." I said, "So the board has no oversight?" He said, "We set the policies. The management company enforces them." I said, "Then who updated the parking rules?" He said, "The board voted on updated rules in March." I said, "I moved in October. I never got notice." He said, "We sent a notice to all residents in April." I said, "I was not a resident in April." He said, "That is not our fault." I said, "You cannot enforce a rule on someone who never received notice." He said, "We will discuss it at the next board meeting." I said, "When is the next meeting?" He said, 3 weeks. I said, "And in the meantime, Donna keeps towing people?" He said, "If she is enforcing the rules as written, I cannot stop her." I said, "She is not enforcing the rules as written. She is enforcing rules she made up." He said, "Send me your evidence and I will review it." I said, "I already sent it." He said, "I will look at it again." He hung up. I checked my email. Still no response to my records request. I called the management office and asked for an update. The woman said, "We are still processing your request. It will be ready by the deadline." I said, "The deadline was yesterday." She said, "We have 10 business days, not calendar days." I said, "Fine, I will wait." She hung up. If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, smash that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next wild story. That weekend, I was walking to my car when I saw Donna in the parking lot with her handheld radio and a clipboard. She was standing next to a truck with no permit decal, taking photos. I walked over. I said, "Whose truck is that?" She said, "None of your business." I said, "Are you about to tow it?" She said, "It is in violation." I said, "What is the violation?" She said, "No permit decal." I said, "Maybe they are a guest." She said, "Guests need a guest pass on the dashboard." I said, "How do residents get guest passes?" She said, "They request them from the office." I said, "I requested guest passes 2 weeks ago and never got them." She said, "That is not my problem." She lifted her radio and called the tow truck. I pulled out my phone and started recording. She said, "Stop recording me." I said no. She turned her back to me and kept talking into the radio. The truck owner came out of a building and started running toward us. He was a younger guy, maybe mid-20s. He said, "That is my truck. I am visiting my friend in Unit 310. Donna said, "You do not have a guest pass," he said. "I did not know I needed one. I am only here for an hour." She said, "Ignorance is not an excuse." He said, "I will leave right now." She said, "Too late, the tow truck is already on the way." He said, "This is insane." She said, "This is policy." The tow truck showed up 5 minutes later. The young guy begged the driver to let him move the truck. The driver said, "I need authorization from whoever called me." Donna said, "No authorization. Proceed with the tow." The guy said, "I will pay you right now to leave it alone." The driver said, "I do not take cash. You pay the yard." The guy looked at me. He said, "Is she always like this?" I said, "Yes, and I am building a case against her. If you want to file a complaint, email me." I handed him one of my flyers. Donna glared at me. She said, "You are interfering with HOA business." I said, "I am informing a resident of his rights." She clicked her pen 4 times and walked away. The young guy emailed me that night. He said he paid $260 to get his truck back, and he wanted to join any group complaint. I added him to my list. By the end of the month, I had 23 people, including Eric the contractor. I contacted a tenant rights attorney and explained the situation. She said, "You have a strong case for selective enforcement and lack of notice, but HOA disputes are tricky because the bylaws give the board a lot of discretion." I said, "What if the board is not following their own bylaws?" She said, "Then you can file a complaint with the state, but that process takes months." I said, "What about small claims court?" She said, "You can sue for the tow fee and the administrative fee, but you need to prove the enforcement was improper." I said, "I have proof." She said, "Bring everything you have, and I will review it, but I charge $200 an hour." I thanked her and hung up. I could not afford $200 an hour. I decided to represent myself in small claims court. I filed a claim against the Villas at Lakeview HOA Incorporated for $290, the total of the tow fee and the administrative fee. The filing fee was $50. The court scheduled a hearing in 6 weeks. I got a confirmation email with the date and time. I sent a copy to the management office and the board president. The board president replied and said, "We will send a representative." I replied and said, "Bring the updated parking rules and proof that I received notice." No response. 2 weeks before the hearing, I finally got the records I requested. The management office sent a PDF with 300 pages of scanned documents. I printed them and started reading. The meeting minutes from March showed a vote to update parking rules, but the actual updated rules were not attached. The enforcement log showed 29 towing incidents in the past 6 months, but only 6 were for backing in, and all 6 happened in the last 4 weeks. Every other tow was for missing decals, expired guest passes, or street parking. I noticed something strange. 4 of the 6 backing in tows were from my building. The other 2 were from the building next door. The rest of the complex had no backing in enforcement. I highlighted that section and added it to my evidence folder. I also noticed something in the financial report. The HOA paid the tow company $4,000 in the past 6 months, but the line item was listed as vendor services, not towing reimbursement. I cross-referenced it with the enforcement log. The math did not add up. If 29 cars were towed at an average of $240 each, the total should be around $7,000, not $4,000. Either the HOA was pocketing some of the tow fees, or the tow company was giving them a kickback. I made a note to ask about it at the hearing. 3 days before the hearing, I got another knock on my door. It was Greg, my neighbor. He said, "You need to see this." He handed me a thumb drive. He said, "My daughter installed a doorbell camera on my door last year, It has a wide angle that covers part of the parking lot and the walkway. I pulled the footage from the night before your car got towed. I plugged the thumb drive into my laptop and opened the video file. It was time-stamped from 11:45 the night before the tow. The video showed Donna walking through the parking lot with a flashlight, stopping at several cars, taking photos of license plates. She walked up to my building and stood near my apartment door for almost 2 minutes, looking at my car, then walked away. I said, "Why was she at my door?" Greg said, "I do not know, but it looks like she was checking which unit you lived in." I said, "That is trespassing." He said, "Technically she is allowed to be in common areas, but the intent looks bad." I copied the video file and added it to my evidence folder. I let her call my bluff, because she did not realize I was not bluffing. The day before the hearing, I got a call from the management office. The woman said, "The board has authorized a settlement offer. If you drop the small claims case, we will refund the tow fee and waive the administrative fee." I said, "What about everyone else who got towed unfairly?" She said, "This offer is only for you." I said, "No deal. I am going to the hearing." She said, "If you lose, you will owe court costs and attorney fees." I said, "I am not going to lose." She hung up. The hearing was scheduled at the Multnomah County Courthouse at 10 in the morning. I showed up at 9:30 with 2 folders, my laptop, and a thumb drive with all my evidence files. The HOA sent the management office woman and a man in a suit who introduced himself as their attorney. We sat in a small mediation room with a deputy standing near the door. The judge was a middle-aged woman who looked tired. She said, "This is a small claims hearing. Keep it brief. I have 6 more cases today." I said, "Understood." The attorney said, "Your Honor, this is a routine parking enforcement matter. The plaintiff violated HOA rules and was towed. He is trying to avoid paying a legitimate fee." The judge said, "Does the HOA have documentation of the rule?" The attorney pulled out a stapled packet and handed it to her. He said, "These are the updated parking rules, approved by the board in March, distributed to all residents in April." The judge flipped through it. She said, "Is there a section on backing in?" The attorney said, "Yes, page 4, section 3. She read it. She said, "It says backing in is prohibited in all parking spaces unless otherwise marked. Is that correct?" He said, "Correct." She looked at me. She said, "Do you have a response?" I opened my laptop and pulled up the original HOA documents I signed when I moved in. I said, "I moved in 6 months ago. These are the parking rules I received. There is no mention of backing in." She said, "When did the updated rules go into effect?" The attorney said, "April 15th. I said, "I moved in October 1st. I never received the updated rules." She said, "Did the HOA send notice to all residents?" The attorney said, "Yes, we mailed a notice packet to every unit in April." I said, "I was not a resident in April, so I could not have received the notice." She said, "Did the HOA provide notice when you moved in?" The attorney paused. He said, "We provide new residents with the current rules at move-in." I said, "I received rules at move-in, but they did not include the updated parking rules." The judge said, "Do you have proof?" I pulled out the lease packet I signed. I said, "This is the parking section from my lease. It references the original rules, not the updated rules." She read it. She said, "Did the management office inform you of the updated rules after you moved in?" I said, "No. The first time I heard about the backing in rule was when the vendor coordinator called a tow truck on me." The attorney said, "Ignorance of the rules is not a defense." I said, It is when the HOA fails to provide proper notice. The judge looked at the attorney. She said, "Does the HOA have proof that the plaintiff received notice of the updated rules?" He said, "We sent a packet to all residents. If he did not receive it, that is a mailing issue, not a notice issue." She said, "That is not how notice works. If the resident did not receive the notice, the HOA cannot enforce the rule." He said, "Your Honor, the rule applies to all residents." She said, "Only if they have been properly notified." I opened my second folder and pulled out the enforcement log. I said, "I also have evidence of selective enforcement." I handed her the highlighted pages. I said, "The HOA towed 29 cars in the past 6 months, but only 6 were for backing in, and all 6 happened in the last 4 weeks, and 4 of the 6 were from my building." She looked at the pages. She said, "What is your point?" I said, "The HOA is targeting specific residents, not enforcing a rule consistently." The attorney said, "That is speculation." I said, "I have photos of 43 cars backed into spaces in the complex. None of them were towed except the 6 listed in the log." She said, "Do you have those photos?" I said, "Yes." I pulled out the printed photos and handed them to her. She flipped through them. She said, "These were all taken on the same day?" I said, "Yes, the day after my car was towed." She said, "And none of these cars were towed?" I said, "Correct." The attorney said, "Your Honor, the vendor coordinator has discretion to prioritize enforcement based on safety concerns." I said, "What safety concern does backing in create?" He did not answer. I said, "The vendor coordinator told me backing in is a safety issue, but she could not explain what the safety issue was, and the updated rule does not mention safety, it just says backing in is prohibited." The judge said, "That is a fair point." She looked at the attorney. She said, "Can you explain the safety rationale?" He said, "I do not have that information." She said, "Then the rule appears arbitrary." I said, "I also have video evidence that the vendor coordinator was conducting surveillance on my property the night before the tow." I pulled out the thumb drive and handed it to the judge. I said, "This is doorbell camera footage from my neighbor. It shows the vendor coordinator walking through the parking lot at night, stopping at my car, and standing near my apartment door." She plugged the thumb drive into a laptop on the desk and watched the video. She said, "When was this taken?" I said, "The night before my car was towed." She said, "What was she doing?" I said, "I do not know, but it looks like she was planning the tow in advance and targeting me specifically." The attorney said, "She was conducting routine compliance checks." I said, "At midnight?" The judge said, "That does seem unusual." She looked at the attorney. She said, "Do you have an explanation?" He said, "I would need to speak with the vendor coordinator." She said, "Is the vendor coordinator here?" He said, "No." She said, "Then I am taking the plaintiff's evidence at face value." I said, "I have one more piece of evidence." I pulled out the financial report and handed it to her. I said, "The HOA paid the tow company $4,000 in the past 6 months, but according to the enforcement log, 29 cars were towed at an average fee of $240, which should total around $7,000. She looked at the report. She said, "Where is the rest of the money?" The attorney said, "I do not have that information." She said, "This is your case. You should have that information." He said, "I can request it from the management company." She said, "You should have requested it before the hearing." She closed the file and said, "Based on the evidence, I find that the HOA failed to provide proper notice to the plaintiff, enforced the rules selectively, and cannot demonstrate a legitimate safety rationale. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. The HOA must refund the tow fee and the administrative fee and pay court costs. She banged her gavel. The attorney said, "Your Honor, we would like to appeal." She said, "You can file an appeal, but the ruling stands until overturned." Hearing adjourned. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The attorney followed me into the hallway and said, "You got lucky." I said, "That was not luck. That was evidence." He said, "This is not over. The board is going to review your account for other violations." I said, "Good, because I have been reviewing the HOA's records for financial irregularities, and if I find anything else, I am filing a complaint with the state." He walked away. I drove back to the complex and parked in my space, backed in. I went to my apartment and sent an email to everyone on my contact list with a summary of the hearing and a copy of the judge's ruling. I said, "If you were towed unfairly, use this ruling as evidence in your own small claims case." Within an hour, 3 people replied and said they were filing. By the end of the week, 7 people had filed. The management office sent an email to all residents saying they were conducting an internal audit of parking enforcement and suspending all towing until further notice. Donna was reassigned to a different complex. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the board president. He said, "We fired the management company and hired an interim manager to clean up the enforcement policies." I said, "Good." He said, "We also discovered that the vendor coordinator was receiving a commission from the tow company for every car she called in, which is a conflict of interest and possibly illegal." I said, "I suspected that." He said, "We are terminating her contract and banning the tow company from the property." I said, "What about the people who already paid bogus fees?" He said, "We are reviewing every case and issuing refunds where appropriate." I said, "Define appropriate." He said, "If the enforcement was improper, we will refund it." I said, "All of the enforcement was improper." He said, "We will see." A month later, the HOA held an emergency board meeting. I attended. So did 20 other residents. The interim manager presented a full audit of parking enforcement. She said, "We identified 42 improper tows, 17 improper boots, and 9 improper fines, totaling over $12,000 in fees that should not have been collected." She said, "We are issuing full refunds to everyone affected, and we are rewriting the parking rules to remove ambiguous language and ensure proper notice procedures." The board voted to approve the refunds. The meeting ended. I got my refund check 3 weeks later, $290. I deposited it and finally felt like I could breathe again. I still see Donna occasionally when I drive past other complexes in the area. She is probably terrorizing new residents somewhere else. But at least she is not here anymore. The final twist came 2 months later. I got a call from Eric, the contractor. He said, "You need to see this." He sent me a link to a local news article. The headline said, "HOA Management Company Under Investigation for Kickback Scheme." The article said the same management company that ran Villas at Lakeview was under investigation by the state attorney general for taking commissions from tow companies, landscaping vendors, and maintenance contractors in exchange for exclusive contracts. The investigation started after multiple HOA boards filed complaints. I forwarded the article to the board president. He replied, "We already gave a statement to the investigator. Thanks for your help." I said no problem. The board scheduled a vote to formally ban Donna from the property. I voted yes. So did everyone else. The motion passed unanimously. The new parking rules were posted in every building, and the interim manager sent a notice to every resident, including new move-ins, with a summary of the changes. Backing in is now explicitly allowed. Guest passes are available on request, no questions asked. Street parking during street sweeping is not an HOA issue. And the board is required to provide 30 days notice before enforcing any new rule. I still back into my parking space every single day. Nobody has said a word. One afternoon, I was walking to my car when I saw a new resident backing into a space near mine. A woman I did not recognize walked up to him and said, "You cannot park like that." The guy looked confused. I walked over. I said, "Yes, he can. The rules were updated. Backing in is allowed." The woman said, "I am the new vendor coordinator. I enforce the rules." I said, "Then you should read the updated rules. They are posted in every building." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling. I said, "If you call a tow truck on him, I will file a complaint with the board and the state, and you will be gone by the end of the week." She put her phone away and walked off. The new guy looked at me and said, "Thanks." I said, "No problem. Welcome to the complex." I realized something that day. Donna was not the problem. The system was the problem. HOAs are set up to give power to whoever is willing to enforce the rules, and if nobody is watching, that power becomes abuse. The only way to stop it is to show up, document everything, and hold them accountable. I never wanted to become the guy who goes to every board meeting and files records requests, but here I am. And honestly, it feels good. A few weeks later, I got a text from Greg. He said, "The board is looking for volunteers to join a new oversight committee for vendor contracts. You interested?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Good. We need people who are not afraid to ask hard questions." I said, "I have plenty of hard questions." The first committee meeting was last week. We reviewed contracts for landscaping, trash service, and security patrols. I asked for itemized invoices and proof of competitive bidding. The interim manager said, "We are working on it." I said, "How long will it take?" She said, 2 weeks. I said, "I will follow up." She nodded. I am still rebuilding my finances, but at least I am not bleeding money on bogus fees anymore. I am still working as an HVAC dispatcher, still recording every call and ticket. And I am still backing into my parking space every single day. If Donna taught me anything, it is that you cannot let people bully you just because they have a clipboard and a radio. You have to stand up, even when it is expensive and exhausting and nobody else wants to get involved. Because if you do not, they will keep doing it to the next person, and the next person, and the next person. I checked my mailbox today. There was a thank you card from one of the residents who got a refund. It said, "You gave me hope that the system can work if we fight back." I taped it to my fridge. It is a good reminder. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.